So it's the 18th of April, and this is Benjamin Donnelly about to ask some questions of Mr. James Horak. This is a continuing of the interview that Crystal Clark did not so long ago. James, I've got lots of questions to ask you. My first question was to do with the concept of partial and full manifestation. You use these terms in your interview with Crystal. I wonder if you could please give us a definition of these terms in relation to each other, and perhaps give a concept or idea of how one moves from partial to full manifestation in thought and deed.
It is more conceptual than literal, and it has to do with identity as a species in full complement of both the elegance of preservation of the species as well as preservation of self. We are unique among the species in that we will throw ourselves in front of a bus to save a child. And the idea of being instinctively, we are absorbed with a preservation of the species. There's no other animal that has that feature, and it's a rather significant aspect of our consciousness. And that we see this declining indicates that we're going the wrong way. Conceptually, as far as our identity is concerned, we have a fragmented consciousness. Consciousness that's not totally capable as it has been in the past when it was unified.
I mean, we have like a romantic viewpoint of, I certainly did when I was growing up, of having an alien helping me out and going in front of a bus to save a child. That's just a romantic human viewpoint.
Well, we don't even think about it. It's an instinct. Gorillas have a similar instinct, but not that particular instinct. Humans are compelled to be certain ways, and the fulfillment of the human at his best involves a sense of outrage and moral core. That has declined. Our ancestors in America, for instance, started a revolt over increased taxes and rather unresponsive government in Great Britain, run by a monarch who was losing his mind. But today we have 20 times the cause to be upset they had, and yet due to media bombardment operating against our self-interest, we have very little sense of outrage, none in the aspect of a healthy sense of outrage, which is just an aspect of our territoriality as animals. And that's not even working for us. Partial manifestation is a declining consciousness. It is one that loses touch with reality easily. It can be mind-controlled easily, that can lose the perception of the bigness of the universe, of the way in which things are connected, can even denounce on the basis of how a thing is programmed to the mind, the appreciation of design. Some of the things that I've discussed, I find that if I get into the spiritual aspect of it, I anger a great many people to the extent of being outraged, because they've divorced themselves from design, they've divorced themselves from anything that could suggest God, and yet they are all victims of something much less an ideal, and don't seem to be worried about it at all.
It's sort of like an extension of that. I was thinking about this concept of a holographic reality. Some people form the opinion this is just a hologram, and so nothing really matters because it's just a hologram. However, from what you said in the last interview with Crystal, everything seems to have a purpose and design. When I think of hologram, the thought that comes to my mind is that there must be a point of imitation. In other words, the hologram is something partial of the real thing. Is there a point of origin of this hologram, and is the real object of the hologram what you would term full manifestation?
We are too mechanistic on this planet. We don't realize that there are forms and aspects of energy that don't comply with the minute understandings we have of electronics, of atoms, of electrons, in the way in which they operate along the conductor. Tesla understood that. What made him magnificent is that he went so far an understanding that was uniquely his that he couldn't share it with others. And that is the distinct difference between someone that has had access to higher levels of technology and science that exist off-planet elsewhere. They wouldn't be able to explain it to someone that had been burdened by these false notions of how things are put together and how they keep running.
Yes.
You create an illusion, and that illusion parallels your idea of a hologram perfectly because both are like a bubble. And both of them can burst just as easily.
You don't hold with the concept of the hologram, then you interpret it as something else.
No more than I do of electron flow through a conductor, and absolutely not an agreement of most of the science laws that are set down. Principles, yes, you have some concrete examples of principles in science, but all laws are limitations. A law is a limitation on excess, but in science there should be no laws until you're perfectly satisfied that you understand all aspects of something so well there are no anomalies left over, because they're not pie crust that you cut off and throw away. They're attached, they stay attached, and they keep pestering you until you resolve them.
The thought that comes to my mind is, of course, molecules, atoms, electrons, and protons. And remember when I was doing a bit of reading about this, the curious thing is that no one's really seen them as far as I understand it. The idea being that they're too small, and then when you actually focus your attention on them, they tend to go away. In other words, we seem to be like in an operation, like being in observer mode. The Higgs boson particle, the so-called God particle, has been mentioned as a basic building block of our creation. My personal feeling is our experience of reality is what I call observational points, and it's just a question of interpretation. I wondered what your viewpoint was on all this. Is that how you would interpret it, or how would you see that?
With all of these problematic conclusions that science indulges, you eventually lose track that when you are going from one place to another, in order to get there, you define a vehicle of some sort. And when that vehicle doesn't go from that next point to a new one, then it's not fit for that form of travel. However, the theories that are applied here are just like that. They work so far, and when they work no further, trying to build arguments and to turn and twist configurations like epicycles on a model of a solar system and universe in the Middle Ages is absurd. And you see people doing it all the time in the name of science and technology when they're not willing to give up the vehicle that made it from point A to B but won't make it to point C. That's what you have to do. If it serves you from A to B, but won't serve you from B to C, then it's not relevant anymore. The idea, let's say, of a God particle is presumptive, and the concept that you could understand the origin of it all with a smoking gun. One smoking gun is like the problem ufology has come across, that all phenomena that relate to the genre can be ascribed or explained by one explanation of one event.
Right.
Smoking gun. Does not exist. It doesn't exist in cosmology. It doesn't exist in science. It doesn't exist in the universe. The complications are so propounding that they are part of growth. You have no fixed stasis. You have no fixed point of reference. Doesn't exist. You understand that everything that you put together concretely has its own bubble.
I'm going back to Crystal's wonderful interview that she did, and she was talking about our origins in our deceased star system. I wondered if the Sphinx in Egypt is a clue to the whereabouts of where we came from. I think from my memory serves me rightly, it points to the vicinity of the Leo system. I wondered what your take was on that.
Oh, yes, because our original system was on the other side of the constellation Leo.
So was it a deliberate attempt by our ancestors that built the Sphinx?
Yeah, originally the Sphinx had the face of a lion.
Interesting. What was the time? Can you put a time period on that when that was actually built?
Yeah, it's right in the middle of the last extinction.
Approximately how many years ago would that be?
42,000.
I can't remember what the current aging of the Sphinx is. I don't think it's made to be that old.
They can only determine the aging by one surface. Let's just suppose, for instance, for argument's sake, that it had been sandblasted. That toward the end of the last extinction, it was sandblasted to look nicer. Took off 12,000 years, right?
Right, yeah, okay. Interesting concept. You talked about moons last time, and the idea of, I think you told me one time that on moons themselves, this is where actually life was seeded on moons to a point where they would actually be put onto planets.
I didn't say seeded. I was talking about that a moon can be terraformed. Moon can operate like a planet and also operate as a vehicle. In fact, moons can be created artificially, like our moon is an artificial moon. Now, that sounds spectacular, but a sun can be terraformed too. A while back, during one of the periods when the sun was fractionating, a fissure was all the way across it. As a series of EMVs began to work to compact it back and make it stable, there was a period where you could see a triangle, a large triangle, which was like the facet to a geodesic dome, because it has a substructure, and that substructure is artificial. The sun didn't start out as artificial. After this system began to house intelligent life, repairs to the sun were made. The sun is like a furnace. It has to be controlled. It has to be fed. It has to be repaired. And these things, science wants to dispose to chance and to fictional explanations that change from decade to decade, if not sooner. And, the day will come when people will laugh at them, just like they laugh at the idea of the flat earth. But those things aren't given up easily. And membership in the Flat Earth Society persisted until the 19th century. You have to bear in mind that change comes very hard for people that have sublimated so deeply into their belief systems. Belief systems do not have to concrete the thought and marginalize it. Belief systems can be controlled by the moral core that I talk about. If you have made as a rule of thumb that you will pursue the truth above everything else, and that you will give everyone their due, including their thoughts their due, you won't be concreted into your beliefs, and your beliefs can grow, change, and sometimes maybe you can just leave them and go on to something else. But to see people agenda-driven blindly by belief systems, in my view, that's a partial manifestation because there's no room for growth. We're here with a full complement of adaptability. How can we be complete if we have no adaptability?
But it's interesting, James, when you look at the history of science and the inventions that have happened, the leaps, if you like, of consciousness that have occurred, it's happened against the natural order of things. People have come across things despite the system, which I find quite intriguing, really.
That is because of the war that's going on between those that oppose change and those that revere change. If you have any respect for growth at all, then you must accept change because change is the direction growth takes you. If we didn't need change, we'd have no hunger, we'd have no disease, we'd live longer, we'd be happier, we'd have no war. We have a lot of room to grow in a new direction. Now, what we have today is science and technology to subvert that, to turn that formula on its head the best way they can. Now, that is corruption. That's a corruption not just of the ideal, but it's a corruption of science and technology, because when science and technology no longer serve man, then they're useless. They're worse than no science and no technology at all.
It's interesting you say that, because today I was looking at the front page headline of one of our UK newspapers, and it had an article by Tim Berners-Lee. Remember Tim Berners-Lee, the guy that gave us the internet? And he
yeah, I thought it was Albert Gore.
Well, you're probably more right, but that's what he's known for anyway. And what he says is that the policing of the internet and all that's happening around that is just making it totally redundant, and it needs to stop, or it will just lose its purpose.
That's right. That's right. Well, that's a good illustration of my point. We live in a time when things are moving so fast that a lot of people that wouldn't otherwise wake up are waking up because they are seeing people like me and you, and we're conspiracy theorists, or were. We were conspiracy theorists 5 years ago. Today, we are the new prophets, and people are waking up to that. They're seeing that. For most, however, it's going to take hunger. It's going to take hunger because until they're hungry, and not just hungry from lack of food, but hungry from lack of what they're used to getting, the entertainment media bombarding them with light comedy, light drama, light everything. When that stops, and when the tune that they have danced to for so long stops, and there's a lull, and they look around them maybe for the first time, they'll see things they denied were there. They can't deny so easily anymore because the comfort zone they were protecting is an illusion they can't sustain anymore. Even with the most burdened rationalization, they can't sustain. Just look around. We are beginning to face so many things we took for granted as being true that we are compelled today for our own survival to re-examine for truth, like vaccinations, like assuming that the standard medical practices are voiced of wisdom instead of greed. And when we realize that the agencies of the government are as corrupted as any criminal organization, then we don't just step back. We step back long enough to get our hands on something to come forward very quickly. And that's going to happen. Something that is elegantly going to happen, but it's going to happen.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, I think as far as the agencies go, I was going to move us forward to JPL and NASA, and I wondered if you could comment on what we're all familiar with as our planets in the system. Do you think that there are phenomena out there are planets that they haven't accounted for?
Yes, and that's admitted. There are planets in our own system they haven't accounted for.
There must be a reason for that. Do you think it might be because it challenges our present view of
Absolutely. Absolutely. It challenges everything. You see, when you base a model of anything in parallel with the power structure, according to the power structure, both has to be inviolate for that model to reinforce the authority of one with the other. The church had to make the earth the center of the universe, didn't it?
Yes.
The church had itself to be the center of God's love. It had to be endowed with the ultimate authority over everything. It had to relegate everyone to absolute subservience with the fear of heresy if they did not submit.
Was it Galileo or Copernicus that got persecuted, or both?
Both.
Both of them.
Galileo had so many friends, and he was a very interesting character. He was a great conversationalist, very intelligent and witty, or he wouldn't have survived. If he hadn't had so many powerful friends, they would have burned him at the stake for being a heretic a dozen times. But he was threatened with heresy so many times that I would imagine probably 25 times in his life. And all he did was say, look, there are the telescopes. See if you can see what I can see.
Uh-huh.
That just...
Now, speaking of telescopes, I'm curious that given how many telescopes there are on this planet and the fact we have the Hubble telescope, how does a cover-up take place exactly? Are the telescopes under close scrutiny, or are they only allowed to view certain places?
Well, if you look, Benjamin, you'll see that a lot of the new comets that have come through, including Hale-Bopp, are all discovered by amateur astronomers. And there's no way that a professional astronomer with one of these refractory telescopes or radio telescopes didn't pick it up first.
Huh. It's
It's just that when this person, this amateur astronomer, was giving credit, he was just the first to bring it up and point it out. He was the Galileo. Look, see, it's there.
I mean, I remember with the Hubble telescope, didn't they have a problem with the lens or something?
Oh, yes, when it was going by Saturn.
Yeah, because I know, I was very excited.
Oh, it's really funny. If you've seen pictures of them grinding that lens, you know that they can't grind that lens in outer space. They have to bring it back, and they put it on a mill table, like it was a piece of metal, holds it down, and they bring a diamond cutter around the edges of it to bevel it just perfectly. It's almost a semi-facet. What it does is it prevents distortion. So if there was any kind of aberration in that lens, they would have to bring it back to Earth. What they did is they lied. They said, oh, there's an aberration in the lens, so that while it went through Saturn, the images that it took, they didn't have any compulsion to share with anybody, so they could see those EMVs.
My God. Huh.
And so, how did they repair it? They sent somebody up who messed with the focus, the little focus telescope on it. It didn't touch the lens. There was nothing wrong with the lens. And of course, when you're getting data, that focusing telescope doesn't have anything to do with the operation.
It's just incredible the things that these people are holding back from humanity. I mean, the images that they must be privy to that we're not, it kind of makes me angry, really, and also very sad.
Well, I'll tell you something right now. There are a ton of astronomers that if they hear us talking right now are going to be throwing their hats up in the air and saying, finally, finally, yay, because they want this out just as much as we do. You got a lot of good scientists. You've got a lot of good astronomers that despise Carl Sagan, for instance, just as much as I do. I mean, God bless his memory.
As far as the position of these telescopes, and is that very closely monitored?
Yeah,
it is.
Well, it's a job to move the barrel of one of these observatory telescopes to focus it in on an area. And so for that reason, they're very scheduled in where they put it. And when it's not in use, you can rent time on it, but it has to be in that area. So the area you want to look at has to conform to the area where that telescope is generally already, because they're not going to move it very far for you. It's a big deal because everything has to be done. It's not easy. It's expensive and time-consuming, which I understand. But these telescopes that they have today have incredible capability. The optics on these telescopes is just, they're not telling you about, because they don't even want you to know the optics they have in the satellites, in these spy satellites or whatever. They have optics you wouldn't believe. But telling you what capability they have, then you'd be asking, well, why can't we get some good pictures of the moon? Why can't we get some good high-resolution pictures of Mars? They wouldn't have any excuse. So they hide their capabilities. I've got books that show the moon, that show the other side of the moon, show Mars and so forth, just as good high-resolution photographs as if any that were taken with the comparable cameras on Earth. The images that they publish are intentionally distorted, blurred, out of focus. It's like, well, you're not one of the ordained, so you're going to have to peer through a curtain of some sort. And that's the way it is. Information has become more regulated than drugs and booze.
How true that is. It's very true. I have a memory of Stanley Kubrick having access to some pretty amazing cameras. And, of course, that goes into the conspiracy of Kubrick and the space program. But they had incredible resolution, and that's going back some years, so it doesn't come as a surprise to me. Okay, change the subject slightly. Crystal was asking you many questions about the Druge, and one question I had was, how did our ancestors make contact with the Druge before they came into this system? I mean, you've mentioned that there were other people living in the system at the time. Why was it that they didn't make contact? Why was it the Druge specifically that made contact with their ancestors? Was there a reason for that?
You know what a buoy is in the ocean?
Yes.
B-U-O-Y. There are those in space. The object they found on the moon is something like that. But they began to scan for compressed light waves. They carry messages. They carry information. And, of course, the Druze have been around a long time. We're talking about a civilization that was much older than ours in the system we came from, and had changed, had modified itself so many times that it had become disgusted with matter, with having to conform to the exigencies of the flesh. But they still had put out information because they hadn't lost all aspect of the gregarious nature all intelligent civilizations enjoy. So all you have to do, if you have the technology, which our ancestors had, to look for these messages and to find help or guidance or whatever, is to look for it, because it's there. It was in the monolith. It's part of the way things are. The community of civilizations and intelligent life is profoundly all around us. It's not just in degree, it's in aspect too.
I was thinking about our ancestors a lot after Crystal was going through the history. They had quite a checkered history for sure. They seem to have destroyed their own system, and Mars went under as well. I mean, I was thinking they probably could be your worst neighbors. That's why I was wondering why. Was that a reason why the other races in the system didn't contact us? That was one thought that came to my mind.
Oh, they have contacted you.
They have? Oh.
Yeah, they've contacted you over problems, not to interfere, but like removal of the EBs, for instance. That was one of the concerns because that had corrupted the experiment here. Basically, you're an experiment because to see if your weaknesses can be overcome, if there can be an evolutionary advantage to what has so long been looked upon as damaged goods, your split consciousness, and your propensity to eat the manure of a caste system of maniacs.
But James, even before split consciousness, we seem to be having disasters. So I was wondering whether it's something that goes deeper than that. Is this why, after so many extinctions, we are prone to the same mistakes? Is that how an elite keeps forming?
Well, those are questions that the people that didn't stay on Earth and are relocated elsewhere now are very sensitive to. And that's why they are your worst critic. You see how that plays out.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, going on. I had a question also about the Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons.
We've all got a little of Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals in us. We have a real party going on in our DNA, and I love it. I think it's beautiful, you know. We do not realize, especially in a world where you have critters that are in eugenics and think that they can do to people what the Egyptians did with cats, and you can't. A vibrant, versatile genetic pool is essential to survival. The more variation in there, the better. You got to take the good with the bad, but you got to have a lot of both in order to be able to weather the future.
That's a really good point, because I've got one very good friend of mine and someone that is sharing a house with me. They're both genetic scientists, and they were saying it's absolutely paramount for a race to have a large, diverse genetic pool.
Yes, they're good men. See, they've gone the other way than the monsters. The monsters want to control. Anytime you hear the word bloodline, you're talking about the creation of an inferior species. You're talking about people that are obsessed with privilege over worth, over accomplishment. So what do? They've got to go the other way, don't they? Because that's the objective. You know, if they can fool you into believing that bloodline is advantageous in the evolutionary sense, if they can fool you into believing that, then you've already bought the lure, the hook, the sinker on a 3-inch cable. Bye.
What I tend to find with these guys, though, is that they tend to co-opt things and usurp them. So often you can have a tendency to just ignore what they're doing, but they've actually, for example, with the bloodline, I think there is something quite interesting about blood groups. But it's not what they say, it's something else.
No, you're absolutely right. There is something interesting about them. I refrain from talking about them because I don't want people to take the wrong notion about what I'm talking about for the same reason that when I'm talking about population control, I'm not talking about depopulation. I'm not talking about selective procreation or anything like that, because after all, variety is very important, and people have their own right to choose who they want to have offspring with. The state should stay completely out of that. But there are times when, due to the situation or the circumstance, like right now, who in their right mind brings children into this mess?
I know. I mean, Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, they were on Earth prior to our ancestors arriving?
They were here when they arrived.
And so the Earth was very unstable. I think you mentioned that it was being hit by asteroids. So how were they surviving?
Caves underground. They came out to find food and went back very quickly. They had a lot of skills, organization. Both had shaman. Both had keen survival ability. Neanderthal was not dumb. Neanderthal was more aggressive than Cro-Magnon, and that's why they eventually wiped Cro-Magnon out. Except for the women, of course. That's what they wanted. They wanted Cro-Magnon's women.
You mentioned the word speciation to me. Could you explain what you mean by that? I think you said that Neanderthals showed signs of speciation.
Well, in the extent, not in the Krober. The anthropologist Krober wrote a book in which he was the first to define speciation, its elements. Elements like nonspecific aggression, for instance. I wouldn't. First, years ago, I used to think that this was speciation between Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal, but it wasn't. It was more like what happened in the Peloponnesian Wars, what happened in the Punic Wars. It was a matter of going in and taking what you wanted because you could, and, thinking like a savage. But they incorporated these women into their tribe, had children with them. Eventually, there was an amalgamation between Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal, and we have that genetic makeup in our genetic pool. And, of course, it shows in some groups. Some groups have the brow ridge. They have a certain set of the jaw. But that does not in any way define their intelligence or indicate any lesser capability or whatever. Cro-Magnon man had a larger cranial cavity than we have. When you get down to trying to determine adaptability and intelligence advance, the idea of progress gets thrown at every turn. We think in terms of evolution of going from a tree shrew to a human being, and that's just erroneous. That's just totally erroneous. I hate to ever side with catastrophists, but I have to there. Because it's like I say, and I say over and over again, that intelligence is so rare. By that I mean sentient intelligence is so rare that there has never been a compilation of data in all the millions of years that extended communities have compiled these things to justify a conclusion that it has bilaterally evolved. It seems to have come from one source. Now, that's not determined 100%. But close enough for me to say that, at least at this level where I'm talking to people here now, that essentially that's true. Essentially.
Did the Neanderthals and the Cro-Magnons have unified consciousness prior to our ancestors?
That's a very good question. I don't know.
What was that they were breathing? Was it helium-based or?
No.
It wasn't?
No, Earth wasn't stable. That's a very good question. It wasn't stable then. That's one of the reasons why the argument to put the moon in when it was moved from Mars to put it around Earth, that it would help stabilize the planet, and it did. It did. Without the moon, the engines that were placed by the Druze on the Earth and gridded wouldn't have worked very well. They wouldn't have been able to do the things to manage the mantle and to control the quality of the atmosphere, of the gases in the atmosphere, as well as they did, and create a more extended magnetosphere and a more protective ionosphere.
I wondered about what, if any, was the interaction between the Neanderthals and the Cro-Magnons and the Druze and our ancestors. Were they able to communicate in any way, or?
No, the Druze had communicated with hardly anybody for a very long time. And the only reason that they did with humans that came from outside the system was because they knew they wouldn't have to put up with them very long. Because when you get to the level that the Druge was, you have a tendency to find more fledgling civilizations repulsive, repugnant. But they helped more out of a spiritual sense than anything else. Of course, they were disgusted with some of the things that they saw. It's primarily like your ancestors that left Earth and elsewhere. They don't like to be reminded of their savage past.
I know you mentioned that there was a time when those elements of NASA were able to go on to Mars and the Moon. Were they able to have access to or see remnants of the Druze civilization? Were they able to engage with artifacts and their history or philosophies, that sort of thing, their culture? Were they able to access that in any way, or was that not allowed?
It was allowed. They just didn't want to crack that nut.
When I think of things that you and me love to read and write, how wonderful it would have been, I think, to see what philosophies and cultures the Druze had. It would have been amazing to see what their thoughts were on EMBs, for example. What would be their perspective of it? It would be quite profound, I would think.
Yes, it would be. It would be. These are things that you're denied. These are things that the monsters deny even themselves. They don't want to know because of the presumption that they're the best. They have it dissolved right in front of them, undeniably.
You mentioned one time about other races living amongst us besides the blondes. I wonder if you could talk about those races and what time periods they were with us for and what actually happened to them. If there are any of them remaining with us even today.
Oh, yes. Yes, but they're in the inner earth. And, sometimes they get involved with the blondes. You have to realize the concept of trans-civilization that exists very well protected, that is out of reach of explorers and discoverers of your own because they know what your past is. They know what your savagery is and how easily it can return. If you read back through the histories and you go to the painters of the Middle Ages, you'll see all kinds of things portrayed, like coneheads being slaughtered.
Were you talking about that before? Sort of had very elongated heads.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You see that there have been children that have come from the deep earth that were green. They didn't know where they came from, so they were adopted in a French village, lived for a few years and died early. You have all sorts of things that go on. These people have figured out ways of protecting themselves from you.
Thank God.
Thank God, right, yes. Well, there were tribes of Indians living here. What comes to mind is I knew the Seneca. These were members of the Tecumseh Nation, Iroquois, Algonquin, Seneca. And the Seneca was dressed just like Europeans before Columbus. Clothing. These people liked feathers a lot. Other than that, they looked like a courtesan at court. They had the wheel. They didn't use it for a carriage or anything because they didn't build roads. They didn't want to desecrate their sacred lands. But they had paved walking paths. They had all kinds of stuff. They had terraces. They built structures that outlast the pyramids. Earthworks, but they had the wheel, and they used it to grind corn.
I mean, these other races, James, did they have coping strategies to deal with split consciousness more than us? I mean, did they have more of a facility to gain unified consciousness? I mean, surely they must have more of an awareness than we do.
Split consciousness doesn't come into being problematic until your technology develops to a certain extent and war becomes a method of economy or of conquest. You have things like manifest doctrine, and you have beliefs that you got to get there first. Just mindsets that drive that gap between the conscious mind further and further. With Indians, for instance, who have learned to live in a balance. They didn't have overpopulation. They didn't have a need for the kind of systems that we erected because we were told by media to do it. They didn't get ulcers from having to keep to a time schedule rigidly, and you can't compel them to today. There are certain things that allow a split consciousness to perform like a unified consciousness until you add mind control, until you add the stress that media puts on everybody to buy, to have a certain fashion, to wear makeup. We do it worse to women than anybody. It's a wonder our women aren't babbling idiots.
Population control and that wonderful newspeak term of sustainability is mentioned so much these days. Sterility and live hormone experiments with estrogen and testosterone imitators, I think irradiation are rife. Do you think there's
We have it of meat in the United States now.
You do?
Irradiation, yeah.
Oh, yeah, of course you do, yeah. I mean, is there a natural way population is reduced and controlled without these things? I mean, if we were not to have any of these things...
Wisdom.
Just wisdom.
Wisdom, yeah. First of all, we raise children, and then we give them a certain amount of guidance, and then we turn them over to a public school system that is not fit to be a babysitter, much less a moral and educational guide of any kind. Then we let the pinheads of the community in the way of a school board determine what they can and cannot be taught, and then the government steps in on top of everything else. And before it's all over, political correctness raises its ugly head, and that is the fascism of the 21st century. Political correctness. And what agenda does it serve? Why, it's almost like a primer for the New World Order, isn't it?
Yeah, if you look at the programs we have in the UK, we have programs to do with judgment, loads and loads of programs to do with judgment. People judging you that probably aren't fit to judge you. It happens a lot. You're having to get used to being searched a lot, of always being the guilty party, getting used to being controlled in so many ways. That brings me nicely to the next subject I wanted to talk about, which was the idea of non-interference from ET. This is spoken about a lot with great authority by many in the alternative media. The Brookings report categorically laid down the fact that we would be corrupted by an advanced civilization. And Arthur C. Clarke's book, written almost under duress, speaks about ET inevitably dictating terms to our world. I think the book that has that in its childhood's end. Yet without so-called interference, we would have exterminated ourselves long ago, and life would be severely compromised. Invasions and certain groups of ETs are mentioned as terribly evil and ruling the show here on so many levels. Yet, as you pointed out, we can do a great job of killing ourselves off without any help from ET. So what is the observable paradigm as far as ETs are concerned? Is there a pattern of behavior that you could detail and give to people so they don't have fear, that they can see a greater perspective of what might be going on?
At one time, the beginning of a system that was friendly to complex life was highly engineered, highly directed, highly precise, highly controlled project. But after a profusion of civilizations and extended communities developed, then it's more a matter of chance. And as contingencies and exigencies and failings, disconnects, different things happen. You know, there are all kinds of possibilities. Things today are made to accommodate those changes rather than start off from scratch. So it's a matter of, keeping things for the most groups, most people, the most communities survivable, and taming suns, doing what you have to do to maintain stability, constancy, the essentials, and being in place when it comes to civilization beginning to feed on itself and decay to the point that we're getting close to here. It's not an aspect of decline to destruction. It's a growing pain that's either going to be evolutionary or it's going to destroy the survival of that civilization, that planetary civilization, or sometimes even a system.
I guess what I'm getting at is that you hear so much about the Anunnaki or the Galactic Federation of Light or Ashtar Command and all this stuff. I was wondered what your take is That's why I mentioned the word paradigm. Is there a sort of a natural protocol that takes place as far as ETs are concerned and split consciousness beings?
First of all, everything you listed is a fiction. It's an invention. It's to try and set a mark to keep you from looking at something real.
Right.
So there are a lot of people that will believe things if they are according an element of myth to them that is biblical or is Sumerian or Chaldean. Once there was a fascination with the exotic, the noble savage, oblige sauvage. Now it's with clay tablets from 11,000 years ago or so. I mean, even I do it sometimes because just to show that I am not mute to history or to archaeology, and I respect honest endeavors and truthful conclusions. But a lot of hoaxes, a lot of people coming forth who would have an open mind, were they not fixated to some extent with the past that is based on religious myth.
You hear so much about people channeling various entities and beings, people meeting reptilians and all sorts of things. Is all that just fabrication?
Well, like I say, there are people that are cold-blooded, but they don't come around here because of the bad rap that has been given with all this reptilian nonsense. Most ETs could walk down the street, and if they were wearing fashionable clothes that were customed to Earth fashion, you would know. You wouldn't recognize them. And some of them, I mean, the blondes are outstanding, but they have an ability to blend in. And you take a woman that's 7 foot tall and 7'4" in high heels walking down the street that is extremely well built, gorgeous, and beautiful. Nobody notices her. I saw this myself. Looked like Anita Ekberg, I swear. You have a lot of ETs that are not blondes that come from all over that are a lot less noticeable than that. But you do have some ETs that, due to the extreme environments and so forth, have developed rather startling features, but they're not ugly, and you get to know them. They have their own beauty. Harsh features don't tend to make people harsh. When you understand something about them, you get to know them, they don't look harsh anymore.
What's the most popular form, if there is a popular form, of communication between these beings? If one race meets another, how do they communicate with each other?
Empathetic mind. Same kind of communication I have with EMBs.
Could you explain a bit more? Is that just picking up on emotions? Is it thought projection?
It's like a fine tuner into a form of telepathy where the emotions can become expressed like words, as fine as words. You have an emotional complement you've never figured out how to use here. And your ancestors not doing a good job elsewhere either. Because, I mean, you guys are fixated with your mouths and your behinds. You are. There's something about it. It's a trait you have.
When I hear these stories, I just wish I had more perspective on things, really. I have the romantic side of me feels that the more perspective I have, the more I'd be able to empower myself with awareness, really. But you don't know. I mean, when you mention that example about blondes just walking amongst us, our minds must be so easily prone to psychic blocks. As you can see so many incredible things even without looking at ETs every day. Why is it so remarkable that should be blind to you?
Well, I'll give you one of the reactions of an elegant ET civilization that was exposed to Mozart. They were listening, and one of them said, "I wonder if he masturbated." Yeah. I mean, that's a telltale. Or you're thinking about some of the greats. Let's say Euripides. You're thinking about Euripides, who is a spectacular playwright. And an ET might say, "I wonder if he would blow bubbles with bubble gum."
That's pretty weird. It's like...
When people compress time, think about it. When people compress time, they mix all of these images.
Right.
It's just a feature of that. And when they go to understand humans, they really have some problems because you guys are such a mixed bag. And so, first of all, our concept of order has to change, because it's just like one of that statement that I made about I don't understand how our women don't become blithering idiots because of all the social conventions imposed on them. And just because they've been worse in the past, like wrapping women's feet in the Chinese manner, or stretching a woman's neck 1.5 feet with rings in Africa, or something even worse that we do today with respect to women wearing high heels and putting all this makeup on. We have had our idea of beauty propped up by an industry that makes money off of it, haven't we?
We have indeed. I mean, you mentioned time, compression of time. I had a question to ask you about that. If time is serial, not linear, then the past, present, future are all live, so to speak. How does one engage with the past, for example, in order to rewrite the present and the future?
If time had never been tampered with, it would indeed be serial. If there hadn't been one vagrant culture and civilization after another to start it with experiments and hydrogen bombs, and trying to go about rudimentary efforts to control their sun and creating something like a solar anvil or whatever, and then fail. If these things hadn't happened, yes. But when it's been altered, then time becomes more cyclical, and it becomes far less disposed to being linear, but still serially cyclical. So if you build a model of time based on cycle, like, say, a circle that goes up and down like a spring, and you want to enter it at a different period, but you want to do so without affecting the continuum. Now, the continuum's going down through the center, okay?
Okay.
And you want to enter one of these coils at your time, you compress that spring down to your time and enter it. That's compression of time.
Right.
Now, there are other aspects to that, too. There are other things you can enjoy, too, if you create that model and with enough energy produce it. See, if you have enough energy, you can do anything. I mean, if you can conceive of something and the model, and you perfect the model of it in your mind, where it complies, where nothing about it fails to comply with what you know to be true of science, what you know to be true of the universe, what you know to be true of your system, what you know to be true of your particular point in the system and its relationship to what is in its vicinity, which is roughly what I speak of when I talk about gravity wave. If you know all these things and you got it down, then you could start building these perfect models. And you build a perfect model of time compression, you can do it. If you have the energy of a sun, or if you have an energy of an EMV that's out on your doorstep, so to speak.
In, say, in our dream state, James, is it possible to do some active time travel in a dream state? Is that possible?
I've often said that the imagination with clarity is its own time traveler. One of the things that I like very much about a person that was here and came around the corner of conventional science by way of metaphysics to discover some amazing things, John Donne, not the poet, but the gentleman that wrote The Serial Universe and An Experiment with Time, hit so many high points that I compare him favorably with Dr. Berggren. These were men that discovered something completely outside conventional science and ran with it. And Mr. Donne created, in the serial universe, created the very first conception that could be modeled of a unified field theory. When you're on the right track about something, develop clarity about it, you'll be surprised how many incorporations that it makes with so many other things yet to be discovered. And that's what that book is so valuable about. My first introduction to that book was through a gentleman that was a Rosicrucian. And he had kind of conspired with an ex-wife of mine who was a German Rosicrucian to join the Rosicrucians and so forth. And after a lot of pressure, because I cared for both of them and because they seemed to be conspiring against me, I guess, be a way of putting it, I joined the Rosicrucians for a short time, and this gentleman asked me to give a report on to this group of Rosicrucians on that book. And he had loaned it to me, and I was astounded by it. And, of course, about the same time, I got my hands on a Rosicrucian Kabbalah. So I told JT, that was his name, a master plumber, by the way. He kept bees, too. I told him, I said, JT, you'd be surprised about the relationships that I'm finding between, it's like just something just clicked together, was put in my path with this Kabbalah and with this book. And he says, oh, my God. He said, would you talk about it? And a lot of things happened in between. I never got around to doing that. I know that I disappointed him greatly.
Oh, dear. Okay.
But, I didn't want to be a Rosicrucian anymore. Let's put it that way.
Right.
And the point I'm making is that any time that you observe clarity, you get into something and you respect its own integrity with your own integrity. That's clarity. Then things happen. Doors start opening. I don't believe a single person that's ever discovered anything wondrous has done it cold. They've done it like that.
We have a question for you from Crystal Clark. She says, if Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal were seeded with sentience in an atmosphere that did not have helium, does that mean the universe was intentionally trying to create a new variety of sentient humans without it, a new experiment?
Well, that's a good question, but I don't think they evolved here. I think that they were people that had been here an awfully long time, but had survived something that went before, and then over a period of thousands of years adapted to this extreme condition planet. And somewhere along the line, Cro-Magnon arrived, maybe a spaceship crashed or whatever, and they survived long enough. There may have been a contingent of them. I think that might be what created those carved out passageways and caverns in the Grand Canyon, where they found so many things that had long since eroded or whatever, but showed a highly advanced technology. Might be where they came from. There were things going on millions of years prior to that. There could have been giants. Look at the dinosaurs. And the fact that they have found human footprints in dinosaur tracks crushing a trilobite. So at one time there was a great adjustment made for the sake of economy of space. And when that adjustment was made, a uniformity came about in the size of intelligent beings. Because they're gregarious, so that they could meet and associate, and one wasn't 30 feet tall and one wasn't 3 inches high.
I remember reading a book by Lana Corinne Cantrell called The Greatest Story Never Told, and she mentions in the book that bones of giants were often put in with bones of dinosaurs, and they knew very well that they were not one and the same thing, but they tried to put them together to cover it up.
That's quite possible. I've seen a couple of things myself in my own experience. But what I dislike and why I usually stay off this subject and don't want to talk about it is I don't want to feed the religious myths that are associated with giants.
Right.
Giants have not lived in any of the lineages of a man on Earth. There have been people 7 foot and some extraordinary people taller than that.
Yes.
But they're rare. They are usually associated with a genetic quirk or a condition, if they're taller, let's say, than the blondes. I dislike feeding these religious myths that don't start off with evidence, but they start off with fancy. And then that grows and grows, and then is fed, and people are out there looking for ways to feed them. That's not objective. That's not science, and I don't like to add to it.
I can put in the same category, I think, when I've heard people talking about the Anunnaki and looking at various things in the past. It annoys me how they just seem to be able to jump to the conclusion. They come across something in the past, they want to attribute it to these beings, and that doesn't make much logical sense. Anyway, let's move on. When the decision was made to move to Earth, you mentioned one faction went to Venus and joined the civilizations that were there. Were there other factions besides them that inhabited elsewhere? Would you be at liberty to give a ballpark where? Did they leave any mechanisms behind that would enable them to keep an eye on where we were consciously, and if so, where?
The only ones that survived are incorporated into other systems, other civilizations. The only one that I'm aware of that has established itself pretty much the way it was a quarter of a million years ago is the group on Venus.
Right. And these are the people that, when things were not going very well on Mars, different factions went different ways. So one faction went to Earth and one faction went to Venus. Is that correct?
Yes, they didn't like the idea of the caste system.
Interesting. And we've got another question from someone else here. They've put, what is it about the split consciousness that is so worth saving from the viewpoint of ET? Is it our sense of humor and our musical ability? And following on from that, does ET have the same kind of music that we have? And does it evoke emotions in the same way it does in humans?
No, it's different. It's different between ET civilizations. It takes a while to appreciate your music, but it has its own intriguing melancholy. It has its own power. It generates emotional reactions that have not been experienced in a while. And some of your music is raw, and even some ETs have a taste for that. But as far as your value of split consciousness, that remains to be determined, whether or not it can come under control and it can be civilized to the extent that you can get rid of aberrancy individually and collectively. Now, I think it can be done because as long as it imbues equally with your sense of moral outrage as it does with other facets, I think that's quite possible. I don't see why it couldn't be done just as easily as with unified consciousness, because all people with unified consciousness are not wise.
I mean, the split consciousness that we have, well, I don't know. I don't have the perspective that you have, but there seems some admirable qualities. And my warped sense of humor doesn't seem to be totally aberrant, you know? I mean, maybe that's debatable. I don't know, but...
Well, I don't think your sense of humor is aberrant. Aberrancy is when a person drifts beyond human decency. You know, human decency is found in the things that we share as innate goodness. Like we should all care about children. All children should be regarded with care and regard. Our elderly should be regarded with care and regard. These are innate qualities that, if fostered and nourished, improve the species. You have people that want to exploit other people, and that's aberrancy. You have people that want to perform misdeeds on other people for some kind of pleasure. That's aberrancy. You have people that can talk about depopulation, for instance, and that's extreme aberrancy. And you have people that look at the profit potential of creating a Gulf of Mexico disaster and laugh. That's extreme aberrancy. These are creatures that do not need to procreate.
I think when you mention all that stuff, one thought that comes to my mind is that the reflection that humanity has is very rarely a reflection such as you're giving now. I mean, if they knew that they were being watched by ET, that there really isn't much that's private. When I started to learn about that, it does make me become more self-conscious. I'm right in saying that, right? People are watching. I'm not talking about the powers that be. I'm talking about other civilizations. They can tune into us. Is that true, or am I sort of being romantic about that?
It's all in your computers. And believe me, myself and ET knows what's in your computers. We know when you came so close to World War III that something had to be done to stop it. That happened twice.
Yeah. When I look at what we have as reflections of ourselves, such as the corporate media, the newspapers, the TV, people, I don't think they're often reflections of people, James. They're just people have to go along with it to some extent. And when I look around people, they're just being socially engineered. The other question I wanted to ask you was that there are people that are not so easily socially engineered. Why do you think that is? Why is it that they're not able to be so easily manipulated as the majority of the population have been? Is it down to genetics? Is it down to something else or an X factor? Why do you think that is?
It's all of the above, basically, but I think the leading ingredient from my experience of observing people on this planet is how that a boy and girl is treated by the parents, by people that are raising them, between the ages of 2 and 4. If they feel that they are precious, that they are unique, if the parents are giving them that kind of love, there is no identity crisis. There is no tendency to overcompensate. There is no tendency to have the ulterior mechanistic attitude that leads to these aberrancies. I think that between 2 and 4, these tendencies develop or they don't develop, and it's all a matter of the parents' adequacy as parents to that child. Not that it isn't important, too, in the rearing subsequent to that, because these children can still be damaged.
Yeah.
There's something particular that happens between 2 and 4. And if these children are giving a sense of independence, to feel that they are accountable in some respects, at the same time that they're loved and nourished, and they're precious to the parents, wonderful things happen. I can't explain it fully because elsewhere, ET children feel like they're giving these choices. They feel like that's important. Their priorities are set. They're given material to learn at an early age, and they become adequate with it. And their senses of accomplishment are not in moral terms or whatever, because the engines of corruption don't exist. They have no way of getting away with betraying their own, or stealing, or thieving, or harming, or whatever. There's just no room for that. I mean, you don't get away with it. So it isn't done. And by the time that an ET child is similar to one of ours at, let's say, 16, they have organized what they're going to do with their life. They have an idea about a number of things. But the socialization development is stable. Aberrancy just isn't there. And they can be trusted. There's no secret keeping to begin with, like there is in this society. There's no feeling of, well, you just are not ordained. None of that. None of that. There's no sense of competing with everybody for favors or any of that. Satisfaction comes from being able to do something for everybody else and become adequate and even excelling. And you see this as something to be shared, not to be given a trophy for and put up on a shelf.
So what if you took a child between the ages of 2 and 4 and put them on another planet? Would they
be the same, even here? No split consciousness, nothing like that. Be just the same. They perform adequately, that they would be equal to anywhere.
So from what you're saying, then, it's a socialized phenomena.
It is. It is. I'd say even later, between 2 and 6. Yeah, between 2 and 6. Over and over again. And it's been done.
It kind of puts social engineering into a...
Yes. Yes, it does.
What a perspective. I remember Chris and yourself were talking about the concept of reincarnation. I was thinking about that, and one of the concepts that was discussed was amnesia. The reason being amnesia gave you a clean slate, so to speak. So I had another idea on this theme. I thought if one had the ability to access genetic memory and have identity separate to all the other lives, wouldn't that be incredibly empowering? So all the tools and knowledge would give you greater awareness and ability to make informed decisions. Is that another possibility, do you think?
You'd be in competition with me then.
I just wondered if amnesia and reincarnation are products of split consciousness. I guess that's where I was coming from.
You got to grow. You got to start out. The whole idea is like, think of reincarnation like this. It's like you're getting on a roller coaster for the first time. You say, oh, no, I want you to slow the roller coaster down. No, you got to go through childhood. You got to learn. The thing is that somewhere back in the idea of reincarnation, that you're fixed with a purpose, that you'll recognize when the time comes. And you believe that you're different and will operate differently when that comes than you did before.
Right.
But that doesn't always work that way. Doesn't always work.
These children that have gone to other planets, Are they made aware of where they came from?
They don't want to come back to Earth.
Really?
Ever. No.
Some of the abilities that they had that might have been geared for this planet, has that been modified? What happens to children? Are there particularities about them that have come from Earth that go to other planets? And
I don't know. I'm sure there are, but they don't affect their performance or their ability to fit in and excel and be just as productive and be just as rewarding to their parents as children born and raised there. They may look different, but so what? Looks don't make a lot of difference to most ET cultures, civilizations.
So as far as parenthood goes, James, I mean, let's say in a Horak world.
Yeah.
There's a thought. The parenting that goes on here, would you think it should be done maybe in a community-based thing? So no child specifically belongs to a parent, it belongs to a community, and everybody has that child's best interests at heart and has a certain environment to maximize unified consciousness?
Well, I think the nuclear family has failed miserably, primarily because of the stress it's put on it in the last 50 years. But even then, it's more or less sterile compared to a more extensive family. If you look back at the immigrants, when they came over in the 19th century, they had to, out of necessity, live together. Uncles and aunts and brothers-in-laws and so forth. And the children had a much fuller range of experience to sift through with these adults living with them, and they benefited. There was always someone around to answer questions and to associate with and so forth. If, for instance, you had a father or mother that was tyrannical, you had someone to step in and say, stop abusing the child.
Yeah.
This is something that some cultures have built in, things like that, but in the nuclear family, you don't. In the nuclear family, if one parent wants to be a tyrant or be unloving or harmful to the child, they can get away with it. But not in more extended, where you have a larger group. Once children start getting their socialization legs and start learning how to deal with various people at a very early age, they learn that they can stand up for themselves, that they can ask questions, that they're free to ask questions. You teach children respect for their elders, but not censorship. And the ability of what a child can develop as a power of expectation depends on that allowance, allowing a child to feel like their expression, their voice matters to everyone else. And you got to give them that voice. And once they start exercising it, their language skills improve markedly. One of the reasons I think that some people don't have the same language skills others do, it's not education, it's how early they were allowed to be expressive.
Yes. Well, these days, we live in a day and age, I can't speak for your country, I can speak for mine, the state is taking more and more of a role in rearing of children. In fact, I've been in this situation a few times when you see lost children and, God forbid, this child approaches you. I'm looking for a lady that's nearby because you're actually terrified of approaching them and actually engaging with kids in any way. If you're a normal guy, it just doesn't happen.
Well, it's these social engineers that are most responsible for pedophilia and for the excesses that lead to harming children. And they, at the same time, want to exercise control over people whose basic concerns for children are very humane, very decent.
Yes.
It's like a power play with these monsters. And we've given in to them, and we really ought to know better. But we need to put our foot down, tell these bastards to get out of our lives, or we're going to get them out of their lives. That's the only way we're going to do it, because they've gone too far. There's one pedophilia network in every country in the world, and it's all coordinated with these power mongers everywhere else. They use pedophilia as a social network to bond with, to maintain their loyalties. They're monsters. I use the word monster. I don't use it reservedly. These people are absolute monsters. They have no human decency. They regard human decency as a weakness.
I was mentioned earlier, but very briefly, that when you look at some of the things like the hormone maskers or the hormone imitators that they're putting into food products, that brings on early set puberty. You're having kids as young as 6 or 7, and of course that's probably something that they would find attractive, and they don't really care about the outcome. I'll move on, because someone else asked a question here, and they said, would you mind asking James about the connection between adepts and off-world experiences or teachings? Were they taken and then returned?
Well, an adept, and I have personally started some schools for adepts. Others have as well. And you find people. Adepts are people that go through the mystery schools and then decide that they want to be counselors to the powers that be, and to use what wisdom and influence that they have learned and how that they can in some way or other affect these movers and shakers to do better than they're doing. And adepts have sat with some of the most remarkable men in history and women, and have had a part in some of the wise decisions that they made. But in order to solidify an adept to his purpose, they end up being sent off Earth, and they come back and they have unified consciousness. So at that point, they are no longer Earth-based humans. And they can get to a point where they don't want to stay here any longer, and they are given the right to decide to go elsewhere. And in the last few years, all the adepts have left, which is not a good sign.
Isn't a good sign.
Well, it's like giving a person a special education, and when they're through, they say, well, this just sickens me. I don't want to stay around and do my job. And, well, okay. But you see, they have a right to that. They have a right to that. I can't argue that they can make a difference because, let's face it, the people that are the power brokers in the world today are all monsters. You have some exceptions, but they're not going to get to the top. And if they do, perchance, they'll get executed, assassinated. It's going to take removing them and removing the system that put them in place. It's going to take that, and there's no other way around it. It can't be done through the system. People that think that it can are daydreaming.
I think that's the frustrating thing for many people, including myself. It's not as if you can find one of these guys in the phone book and contact them or turn up at their residence.
Benjamin, you have to realize this. You have a caste system, right? Let's admit it, that in the last 4,000 years, everything has been based on some form of an elite privileged group ruling over the rest of us, right?
Yes.
Well, that's a caste system. You can call it other things. You can call it a monarchy, you can call it tyranny, you can call it empire, you can call it anything you want, but it's the same thing. You have one group that's privileged over another. And after the first decade or two of that, it becomes a true privilege. In other words, it's passed on to the offspring, or it's passed off to a singular group that stays in control no matter what changes occur in governments or what changes occur in agencies of the government or whatever. It's entrenched. And once you have that, then trying to do anything through it only works for maybe a generation at the most, and then you start getting the same corruptions and so forth, because the authority is put in the hands of people that may not deserve it and are not tested in any way that they deserve it or are adequate to it.
I think the whole onus of it, though, if you look at people that are in finance, those that operate in realms of high finance should be the most morally responsible of people. But in fact, you have the inverse. And when you go across the board, everybody's in the wrong positions. And, it doesn't want to have anything to do with money whatsoever that should have that position of authority and power, because they would probably deal with it a lot better than these guys. But the world's upside down, you have to be a genius to figure that out. But it's covered a lot of ground, James. I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to wrap it up. And thank you very much for taking the time to answer all my long-winded questions.
You're welcome, Benjamin.
Okay, thanks, James.
Thank you.